Hi, welcome to the podcast. This is Challenging Leadership with me, Stephen Mather, and
I'm Jared Scott.
Excellent. So, welcome to the podcast. We're using a slightly different bit of software today, so it'll look a little bit different. Hopefully, it'll look and sound better because we're very keen to have it look and sound as good as possible. And in a way, that might be kind of a very tortured segue into our topic because we're going to talk about making mistakes, aren't we?
We sure are.
Yeah. Okay. So where are we going to go with this?
Well, I was thinking about what we want to avoid talking about ourselves, but I thought let's kick off by talking about how I've made a lot of mistakes in leadership.
Come on, confession is good for the soul.
It is. I figure maybe everybody will forget about my mistakes by the end of this session.
Yeah.
I think the one thing that I've struggled with is proper communication. When you're very close to something, like I've got this sheet of paper, you can't read what's on here. I can see it, and I'm like I can see the whole picture of what I want to accomplish, what I want to do. And then there's some assumptions where I skip over the details with my team or anybody involved. And I just assume they understand, And I think that comes from perhaps not just assumptions, but feeling like I'm just such a wonderful, great communicator that how would anybody not understand what I'm saying? And, that could be part of pride or just thinking you really did dot every I, cross every T. And it's really not the case. So I think assuming that you got your point across as far as the direction you gave is where the trouble begins.
That's really interesting.
Not asking, I think, viewpoint questions. Because, if I said, hey, do you understand what I just said? I mean, that's almost like what mom and dad used to do. And it's a little demeaning. And no one wants to feel dumb. So they just say, yep, I understand.
Yeah,
who wants to tell your boss? Yeah, who wants to tell your boss, I don't understand. I'm dumb, because they're not saying that, but it's implied. So, I definitely think that I've seen some mistakes that I've made when it comes to not communicating properly, effectively, maybe is the better term.
Yeah, I think that's a really common one. I mean, every business I've worked in, it's always stated as one of the biggest problems of this place is they don't communicate properly, and how could we improve it? Well, communicate better, but it's a very tricky one. It's clearly it is difficult to do because every organization seems to struggle with it, and I guess it's partly because we're trying to filter out some of the stuff we don't think is relevant, and we don't want to burden everybody with everything. But yeah, I guess it's about putting ourselves in the other person's shoes. Really, that's the key to it, isn't it? As you say, when we've got all the information there, suddenly it's become knowledge in the world, and we are the world as far as we're concerned. Therefore, it's now known.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Well, as we're doing the confession bit, I suppose I've written down some of my my mistakes as well. I think my biggest one in leadership has tended to be taking everything too seriously, and by that I mean linking my own sense of personal value to the project I'm doing at the moment, or whatever it is I'm doing, the job. If I'm doing a project, it's that. And I think it's good. I'm naturally a very conscientious person. In the psychometrics, I always score high on conscientiousness, which in some respects is good because obviously it's the sort of thing that managers like about you. It's that, you care about what you're doing. And of course, that's a good thing. But the downside is it can become too much, and it becomes such that the fear of getting it wrong, making a mistake, or just not being able to drive it in the direction you want it to go, you just become so frustrated or confused or anxious, I suppose is the real word, that it gets in the way of actually doing the project properly. So I think that's been something that I've really had to work on over the years and put everything into a sense of perspective. And it's a tricky one as a
Yes.
coach to get that right with others, because you want people to care, of course, but on the
Mhm.
other hand, you don't want them to be paralyzed by fear or anxiety, or make it so that they're living a miserable life because they're trying to perform. And of course, a lot of what you do is dependent on other people, and that's where some of the frustration comes, I think. So for me, that's been my big learning curve. That's the thing that I've had to change. I feel like I've got it much better now. I'm not as anxious now when I'm doing a project. I realize that, some things are outside my control. I do what I can. I know I have the skills to do it, but if things happen that are outside of my control, well, I can't control that. I can only respond in the best way I possibly can. So that's, for me, that's where I've sort of fallen down, I think.
Yeah. No, I appreciate you sharing that. It made me think about the other thing that I struggle with is failure to delegate. I and it's like I'm a perfectionist,
Yeah.
and I was reading a book called The Lazy CEO. This was a few months back, and one of the key points that stood out to me was he was saying that if you can have somebody do it 80% as good as what you would be able to do, then have them do it.
Yeah.
You can't have the same expectations for how you accomplish things as far as expecting other people to reach that level. And he says otherwise you're going to burn yourself out. And what happens is you get burned out, and then it holds back your team, it holds back your department, it holds back others from accomplishing great things, and also from they themselves getting better. I'm like, somebody had to let me have the freedom, Stephen, to become better at what I do. If they micromanage me or kept me in check, I wouldn't be where I'm at today. So I'm like, well, I need to give that to other people as well. And
Yeah.
yeah, delegating, it's hard to do sometimes, but goodness, it takes a load off of your plate when you can allow other people to make it their own. Let them have ownership.
And I think that's, we need to do a full episode on delegation, don't we? It's such an
Yeah,
important
probably so. Yes.
topic. Yeah. But it's, I mean, in my courses, I often ask people why is it we sometimes find it difficult to delegate? And it's obvious, the answers are fear of losing control of it. If they get it wrong, it's my neck on the line. All these things are completely understandable. But again, it probably stems from the same problem that I've just mentioned about myself, which is this anxiety that we want to get
Mhm.
everything completely right all the
Yeah,
time, and that's an unrealistic expectation, I think. So yeah, that's interesting. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, for sure.
So I've got a couple of case studies, and I know there's a few more things we want to talk about when it
Yeah,
comes to making
sure.
mistakes. So maybe I'll throw a couple of case studies out there,
Let's do it.
and we can talk about some of the things that maybe we can learn from that. So we're featuring mistakes and things that went wrong, um, and obviously things go wrong all the time. The only time we get to know about it in the wider world, is when it's really bad consequences. So, that's the only time we really get to find out. But of course, mistakes happen all the time, and bad things happen all the time. The first
Yes.
one that I wanted to talk about is one that I don't know whether you've heard of. Probably not, because it's quite UK based, although they did have 1,000 stores in the US. And this is a jeweler's around the 1990s called Ratner's.
Hmm.
So I don't know. Have you heard of that at all, Jared?
It strikes a little bit of a memory. Yes, I
Right.
remember we had
Okay.
a few of those in some of the malls in the area.
Yep. Yep. So it was a kind of I remember growing up, and Ratner's was on the high street, um, sort of budget jewelry. So it was quite
Mhm.
cheap, and it was very popular around the time of the recession, the 90s recession. Um, and it was sort of cheap and cheerful. So for me as a young guy, I might buy a pendant for my girlfriend, or some earrings for my mum or something. It
Mhm.
was that sort of shop where you'd buy something fairly cheap. The guy that owned the store, was his name was Gerald Ratner, um, and he turned his business around. He actually inherited it from his dad, but he just made it into something it never was. It was always a bit of a stuffy jewelers, and he turned it into something dynamic, and where people wanted to go and shop, you know. And on April the 23rd, 1991, he stood up in the Albert Hall in London. So it's a big venue. This is a director's lunch sort of thing. And he was the guest speaker. 6,000 other directors and the great and the good. And he did a speech about his stores and what he'd done. And you can actually listen to the speech. It's really worth listening to. I'll put the link on the show notes. Um, and obviously, in speeches, you sometimes want to be a bit funny, a bit humorous. I mean, we talked about this on the charismatic episode. And so he talked about where his stores were positioned. And you need to listen to it all because it all flows. But
Sure.
one of the things he said, well, we do this, we don't just do jewelry. We do this cut glass sherry decanter, complete with 6 glasses on a silver plated tray. And he said it's the sort that your butler might serve your drinks on, he said with a sort of wry smile. And we can do that all for £4.95.
Hmm.
So just to give you some idea, sort of, I don't know, these days you're probably talking about £20, I should think, something like that
Yeah.
on today's currency. So he said we can do it for £4.95, and he then said, people say to me, how can you sell this for such a low price? And I tell them, well, because it's a load of crap.
Hmm.
And everybody laughs, obviously, because it's a joke. It's a funny joke.
Yeah.
And then he talks a bit more, and he then talks about. He said we also sell a pair of earrings for under £1 for 99p. He said which is cheaper than a prawn sandwich from Marks and Spencers, which is like a food shop.
Yeah.
He said but it probably won't last as long as a prawn sandwich. And again, gotta laugh, you know.
Wow.
And so he goes out of that speech. Everybody's enjoyed it. You know, it's been quite good. Anyway, it gets reported in the local press or in the national press, actually, what he said. And of course, his whole world comes crashing down.
Mm.
And I mean, it's absolute. I think it is the biggest. If you don't count things like, you know, financial crashes, if you're just talking about a kind of simple mistake costing you your business, essentially that's what happened. He talks about it. You can see some interviews. Again, I'll put a link to an interesting interview that he talks about this. But the share price went from something like £4 odd a share to 2p
Oof.
a share. Basically, he just lost it all within a few hours. He
Mhm.
ended up having to step down from the board, and he lost his job. He lost his house. He had to take his kids out of private school. Basically, he was completely rock bottom,
Mm.
all because of that joke, which I think is really, really interesting. So I don't know what your sort of initial thoughts are about that, what mistake he'd made and why it
Well,
was so powerful.
you know, I'm kind of so I'm hearing this story for the first
Yeah,
time, but my initial reaction to this is the challenge of leadership is you can do so many things right, and
yeah,
sometimes there's just one little thing. It's a big thing, but in our mind, we think it's a little thing, and it creates havoc. It creates a lot of problems. I mean, I can definitely see how that might be taken the wrong way by the listeners, the audience, his potential customers, but wasn't thought through. I guess maybe he shot from the hip on that one.
well, yeah, and I think what it did, I think a lot of these things actually reflect something else. So one of the things that I'm interested as somebody who studies organizational psychology, I'm really interested in how we make sense of our world, how we
Mhm.
interpret what's going on in front of us, and um, look at it through whatever lens we already have.
Sure.
And I think what this did is it said something else to people. So it wasn't just that he thought some of his products were crap. Um, it was it was the deeper level that actually it felt, I think, to his customers that he was laughing at them. That he was saying that your your custom is not that important because
Yeah.
you'll buy anything, you'll buy any old rubbish, you know.
Yeah.
And now he it's interesting because a couple of years ago he actually did an interview. So this is 30 years later, and he does an
Mhm.
interview on our Sky TV in the UK. And again, I'll put the link to that. It's interesting to watch it. So now he's grayer and older, obviously.
Sure.
Since then, he's managed to start another business and sold it for a few £1 million, and he's okay now. But you know, it still hurts him. He says how much it hurts him. It's not water under the bridge for him. It
Mhm.
still is really painful, and he's very quick to say, look, it didn't represent a disdain for the customers. Actually, that's not what it meant. But of course, whether he did or not is beside the point. It's that feeling that he was taking the Mickey really out of
Yeah.
the people that were paying his wages. And I think that's the thing to always remember is that the way it's interpreted will be different, will not necessarily match the way that you think you mean it. So I think that there's a kind of lesson there, I think, for leaders.
Yeah.
Of course, this was his customers. These were his customers who turned on him, but also the shareholders, and I'm sure his staff were not too pleased as well. Lots of
Mhm.
them lost their jobs because they had
Yeah.
to close lots of stores. Um, but it's not being aware of how other people will perceive what you're saying. I suppose it links back to the communication point you made
Yeah.
earlier.
Yeah. I just have this image in my mind. I'm not giggling, but I'm just saying you're there in the restaurant. You just gave your girl a piece of jewelry from there,
Yes.
and then up on the TV comes this spot, and she's like, "What is
Yeah.
this? You gave me
Where'd you get
something
it
less
from?
than a
I got it
sandwich."
from Rats.
But
Yeah.
it's so true. And like we all wear biased lenses, and we see everything in this world, like you mentioned, from our point
Yeah.
of view. And we almost create an echo chamber or this confirmation bias with how we view things, and that's a dangerous place to be because it can put us out of touch with whoever our potential listeners are, whether it's our customers, our coworkers, our team. It can affect any of that.
Yeah, and this happens over and over again. I think and sometimes it gets called being tone deaf. I suppose, and I
Hmm.
suppose that's the reality. Recently, there was a bit of a thing going around with Gordon Ramsay, um, who I think most people know both sides of the pond.
Yeah.
The sweary chef
Hmm.
from the UK, and he was telling his story on another podcast about how when he wanted to borrow some money off his father-in-law, he needed £20,000 for a deposit on his house. He asked his father-in-law, and his father-in-law said, "Well, you get rid of that Porsche, and then I'll think about it." And he tells this story as a way to help people understand that sometimes you have to pay something as a sacrifice. But of course, for everybody who can't afford a Porsche, this sounds incredibly tone deaf. Oh, poor
Yeah.
Gordon Ramsay had
Yeah.
to sell his Porsche. And
Yeah.
again, it doesn't it falls like a lead balloon.
Sure it does.
So it's really about understanding your audience. A sidebar on this story, Jared,
Yeah.
is amusingly, he's also known in the UK as the reason why you can say crap on television before
Oh.
the 9 o'clock watershed, because up until that point, the word crap, you just didn't hear it on the news.
Oh.
But at this point, because they quoted him, it became a word that you could actually use while children were watching, which is kind of funny.
Wow. How far we've come with our censorship, or
Absolutely.
lack
Yeah, yeah,
thereof.
absolutely. Absolutely. So yeah, so that's my first example, and I think a sort of summary of that is
Yeah.
about understanding your audience, whether that's your customers or whether that's your team or your manager, and thinking about how it's going to look to them and how it's going to sound to them. I think that's really, really
Hmm.
important.
Yeah.
Have you got any examples?
Yeah. Mine is definitely not humorous. I
Okay.
was thinking about the Chernobyl disaster.
Yeah. Yeah.
And, you know, fundamentally, there were so many failures that happened. I mean, it was like a perfect storm
Yeah.
of events that led to what happened. And even after it happened, the poor leadership continued.
Mm.
And looking back at it in retrospect, I don't think that we could say, "Well, I'm going to have a nuclear meltdown in my role as a leader or a manager." but you can still see the same kind of root causes, I guess you could say. And one
Yeah.
of the things, just looking at it, was the first and foremost problem was is that the culture was all wrong there. You know, the focus was on productivity rather than safety. There really wasn't a safety culture. And then, you know, people noticed things, but they didn't feel like they had the freedom to speak up, like, oh,
Yeah.
I'm going to be punished if I bring this to the attention of the higher ups. And I mean, you can see that reflected. I think, again, that tone deaf attitude, that's definitely not a good leadership quality, where you have people that notice little things, they notice trends, they notice, hey, I don't think the customers are happy with this, but you
Mm.
have the higher ups that just say, yeah, we're just going to ignore that. Well, in this case, it led to a cascade of failures that eventually resulted in a reactor melting down, and
Mm.
that's scary to think that it really all started with that. And you know, ignoring the expert advice. There were people that were much more qualified from the level of engineering
Mm.
to say, hey, this is bad, and they
Yeah.
just ignored it, you know. And so that continual ignoring, and then on top of that, all my sweet spot training, you know, training a lot of times gets blamed. We need more training. Well, in
Yeah.
this case, it was true. There was
Mm.
inadequate training to know how to handle this situation when it does occur or could occur. And it's almost
Mm.
like it was like, hey, we'll roll the dice. We're not worried about that because the likelihood of this happening is, you know, so
Yeah.
small. And yet it happened and nobody knew what to do. So
Mm.
it just built and built. The poor communication, you know, you could really look at it as just every area of possibly doing something wrong when it comes to proper leadership.
Yeah.
They did it. And then the cover up, you know, the lack of transparency.
Mm.
And to me, that's where I think about leadership. We're going to make mistakes. There's no such thing as being a perfect leader. But do you take a problem that has occurred and learn from it, or do you just say, "Hey, we're just going to bury that and keep doing things the way we were doing it because it'll just come back again?" And I think that's really a good example for anybody seeking leadership or in a leadership position. Is what do you do when you realize you've mucked it up a little bit? You know,
Yeah.
do you just go, you know what? Let's just keep on going. You know, so that's what happens sometimes.
Yeah, that's a really good example. There was a I don't know if you've had the dramatization over in the US of Chernobyl on Netflix. I think it
Yes,
was very
yes,
very good.
great show. Scary,
Of
actually.
very yeah. Obviously, there's question marks about some of the accuracy, which there always is when things are dramatized. But I think what it does reflect are some very important factors. Going back a few years now, I did actually work for a behavioural health and safety company in the North Sea, just off the top of the UK, there where they drill for oil, and that was one of the sort of case studies. Another one is the shuttle disaster, or there's two of
Mhm.
them, obviously, and you know what happened there. Uh, these they often have similar factors around these mistakes, and they tend to be, as you said, poor training, people not actually doing the jobs that they are properly trained for. It's interesting about training. Obviously, we're two trainers, so okay, we're going to say this, but it always amuses me how when there is a big disaster or there is a big problem that gets in the news, the first port of call for the representative who stands in front of the camera is always to say, "Well, we've retrained the staff involved, and
Yes,
so and so." And I always think that's the only time that training gets given a priority. You know, otherwise it's always the first thing to go when
I
you're trying
know.
to save money. You know,
Yeah, yeah.
um,
I'm not
that
looking forward to, like, I don't want disasters to occur,
no.
but it's almost like, "Oh, I know I'm getting my call."
That's right. That's, at that moment, you're suddenly important. Whereas before, you know, oh, we can't really release people for this. It's, you know, we're too busy and so on. And then all of a sudden, it's all down to training. You know, it's really important. And that reflects, to me, one of the big problems in industry is that there is a lack of this longer term thinking, which
Yeah.
includes developing people up to a really high level so that they can become expert at their job.
Yeah.
Um, so
Yeah.
that's a common factor, I think, is training. You're quite right about, and sometimes this is down to the processes and systems, and sometimes it's down to the culture, the behaviours, and the two obviously intersect. But how do you create a condition or an environment where people can raise their hand and say, "There's a problem here,"
Hmm.
and famously on Toyota lines, anybody can stop the line.
Yeah.
So that anybody can say there's a problem, I'm going to stop it. Now, obviously, that potentially can cost you millions, but it's nothing compared to the millions if you let a problem go. So it's really about how do we create a situation where people feel comfortable and okay about saying, look, there's a problem here,
Yeah.
um, and the management being willing to listen and take notice. So yeah, I think that is another common denominator here.
Sure. Yeah. And I was thinking about people are afraid to step forward and try to improvise, I guess, or do something to fix the problem immediately if they don't feel like they're trusted,
Yeah,
or maybe they're micromanaged. And so, I mean, you've probably worked with individuals who have been under that umbrella of micromanagement, and they're just so checklist oriented that they'll do
yeah,
only what you ask, and it has to be very specific,
yeah,
and it limits the true potential that that individual has. And I think about if these individuals, say in Chernobyl or any situation, the shuttle disaster. I think about, you mentioned the oil. I thought about the Deep Horizon
yeah.
problem.
Another good one.
You know,
Yeah.
yeah, there's so many areas where it's like,
Mm.
man, if people were just given the trust or the freedom to make a call, as it were, and maybe some of those things could have been prevented. But I think for me, it's important that even if you let somebody make a mistake, don't go back and hit them pretty hard with like, hey, I can't believe you did that, you dummy, or whatever you choose, because now you just went right back to, you really didn't give
Mm.
them the freedom or the
Yeah,
autonomy to do something. So it's like more of, if someone makes a mistake, how detrimental was it? You almost want to say, let's learn from it and then continue to build on their ability to keep moving forward on their own, because it's so easy, that control thing you talked about. Like, it's like if you see, oh, they're fixing to make a mistake, and you say, well, let them do it, and then don't berate them to the point where now they're just never going to do it again. It almost would be like, hey, it's okay, let's learn from this, and then give them another opportunity. Then you can start to see them really blossom and go forth.
yeah. You mentioned this thing about not being afraid to make mistakes, or at least having an environment where people can make mistakes. I mean, this can be very challenging. I read a book a few years ago by a writer called Matthew Syed. I think it was called Black Box Thinking, but basically he was making the point that if you um, look at the modern air industry, that the the uh, aircraft and aircraft design and so on. There are obviously odd exceptions because when anything happens, it's huge.
Mhm.
But in terms of the sheer safety record, modern safety record of aircraft, it's phenomenal. And part of the reason for that is because there is an openness to share if there are errors, if there are mistakes. That is open. Certainly has been. If you compare that to the medical profession, that tends to be closed ranks, and because they're terrified of being sued, nobody wants to actually admit responsibility. And if you can't admit it, if you can't admit you've made a mistake, then you're never going to learn from it. And this is one of the real challenges, I think.
Yeah, definitely agree with that. It's scary to think about that comparison, because there's so many deaths every year from malpractice, and
Yeah,
but you'd hear about it if there's going to be a plane crash, right? And
yeah,
yeah, yeah, their
absolutely.
records actually mind-boggling how safe they are.
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah. So that's another difficult thing, but in a and again, I guess we're all about challenging leadership, and that includes challenging ourselves as
Hmm.
leaders to create an environment where people feel comfortable to say, "Look, I've made a mistake here," or "We have a problem here that we need to look at." Um, you've got to create that those conditions, otherwise, um, you might feel okay because it's amazing how my crew never make any errors. They never make any
Yeah.
mistakes. Well, they are happening. It's just you don't know about it. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Mm, yeah.
Um,
No good.
I've got another one that kind of
Sure.
follows on from that quite nicely, actually. And then perhaps we could talk about some of. I know you've got a bit of a sort of theoretical way of looking at this, which might be quite interesting.
Sure.
Um, so the other one I wanted to mention is again, it's something that's happening in the UK. It's slightly limited what we can talk about on this because it's actually happening now. It's kind of live, but our UK listeners will definitely know what HS2 is. It's high speed 2. Basically, this is a high speed rail link that was designed. We're going back over 10 years, I think, to a time when this was thought about. And in fact, it was probably more than 10 years ago. Basically, this is a high speed rail link that would link London to the northern cities of the UK. So one of the problems in the UK is that everything revolves around London, or it seems to. There are big cities in the north. There's Manchester, Liverpool, Leeds, and so on, Newcastle, and so on.
Hmm.
And these are important cities, but the links too, especially going from the southeast, which is where London is, to the northwest, Manchester, Liverpool, terrible links. Even the road network it just takes a long time.
Hmm.
And so this idea was to create a high speed rail link from London to Manchester. Well, first of all to Birmingham, then to Crewe, Manchester, Leeds, and so it would create these links, these better links between these big cities. So that's the sort of background of it. Now this has been going on for years and years and years, and they've actually started to work on it. I was doing a cycle the other day and I rode across a bridge where they were doing the work on it. It's a huge engineering project. So we've already spent billions on this project. There was recently an announcement by the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, to say that essentially we're cancelling the whole thing apart from the link from London to Birmingham,
Hmm.
which is, about 100-mile link, and that will have cost us by the end of it probably something like 50 billion
Oof.
pounds, which is
Wow.
absolutely massive.
Yeah.
Just to give you some idea, I've got a sort of staggering statistic here. So France's latest 203-mile stretch of high-speed track, which is going from Bordeaux across the south of the country. That's essentially double the length of London to Birmingham. That's
Hmm.
going to cost around 12.1 billion.
Oh goodness.
Um, Ours, if we were to do it the way that we were going to do it, would have cost 100 billion. So they actually have a sort of figure here that says so for I'm reading a Guardian quote here. A UK government commissioned study from 2018 found high speed rail internationally was generally achieved for about £32 million a kilometre, on a range of 11 million to 79 million a kilometre.
Mm.
Phase one of HS2 looks like coming in at around 250 million. So if you think about that, from 32 million, which is the normal average, we're now ending up spending 250 million per kilometre.
Oh
Absolutely
wow.
staggering.
I can't even comprehend that. Is it something about you cross the channel and prices go up? No.
No, I mean this is all in the UK,
I
so
know
no,
this.
this
It's just
is they're not going anywhere other than
not going
uh,
anywhere.
so basically, I'm gonna direct people to the Times of London for this because they've done a fantastic piece
Yeah.
of investigative journalism on this. You get to hear recorded conversations of consultants raising issues with their managers, and you get to hear their experiences of being fobbed off basically and told not to tell anybody about this. It's just
Mm.
absolutely appalling. So I do recommend that. It's if you, I think everybody in the world can get the Stories of Our Times podcast. Check that one out. It's very, very interesting. But without going into all of the details, I think what comes out of it are a few things, again, which you can say are very common in these sorts of problems. One of them is what we've already said, is that an unwillingness to face reality, an unwillingness to face the truth. They are
Hmm.
being told multiple times that there is a problem here. But obviously, politics in the big P is involved in this because the government has commissioned it. But even in the workplace, there's politics. And I think politics often gets in the way of us being able to say, look, we need to do something about this. This is causing us a problem.
Hmm.
And clearly, there was too much political pressure on individuals to actually take notice of the warnings that they were being given here. So yeah, catalogue of errors. We'll get to learn more about it. We might even do a bit of a specific episode on it. But as
Sure.
an example of how not to do a project, this is a great
Yeah.
example. Now we're going to end up with an incredibly expensive line from London to Birmingham, which is going to cut about half an hour off people's journeys, and it's cost us billions.
Wow.
Shocking.
It's shocking, but it's definitely it happens many times, especially when you have government projects.
Yeah. Yes.
If it isn't
Yeah.
broke, fix it till it is.
Well, and there's all sorts of egos in there as well.
Sure.
There's we want this to look good, and of course,
Hmm.
everybody wants to announce a project, but nobody wants to pay for it, and this is always part of the problem. But yeah,
Yeah. Goodness.
yeah,
Well, that's a classic example, and there's many parties involved, isn't there?
yeah, yeah.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah, and
Yep.
again, it's a failure of leadership, really, because no one is really saying, "Okay, let's look this horrible thing in the eyes and say, right, we're going to do something about this." It's always kicking the can down the road, as they say. We'll deal with it later. We'll deal with it later. And there was an understanding that the chickens will come home to roost at some
Hmm.
point, but hopefully by then, either I'll be gone, or they'll go ahead anyway because it's too embarrassing to cancel it, and so there's that kind of feeling as well. So it's there's some process stuff there, but there's also a lot of psychology, I think, there that causes these things.
Yeah. Yeah. It almost reminds me, like in that situation, you have so many cooks in the kitchen, but
Yes.
who's actually in charge?
Yeah.
Accountability, and to me, one of the big failures of leadership is when the leaders don't hold themselves accountable. They're
Yeah.
always looking for someone else to blame for why they're in the predicament that they're in. And I was reading this book. It's by a couple of Navy SEALs, and it's called The Dichotomy of Leadership.
Okay.
And it's interesting because the one gentleman, his name is Jocko. He was serving in Iraq back in 2003. But he talked about how there was many things that happened where it was actually someone else's fault, but ultimately the blame rested on his shoulders because he was the leader.
Yeah.
And how many times? I mean, even myself, I'm like not saying who can I blame for this, but you're just like, where did we fail? When you need to say sometimes, where did I fail? You
Mm.
have to look at yourself first in that leadership position and say, where can I fix this? But the problem, such that project you mentioned, how do you do that when maybe you do have good intentions, but you're dealing with several other leaders that they're not so good at what they do, So it's tough.
Yeah, and the other factor there again, which is actually something relevant to all projects, is that there's constant churn in the leadership. So
Hmm.
partly because of the political nature of it, you have different transport secretaries, you have different politicians all getting involved in this thing. And every time it changes hands, the person coming in has to learn what's going on, and now that could be an opportunity to take stock and to see what's going on, but often that doesn't happen. So you end up with no consistency, and this is again why some of the accountability is lost, because nobody really feels it's theirs. It's been passed on from one person to the next.
Hmm.
So yeah, that it's interesting. what you say, I feel like I need to pick up on that because it's really, really interesting point. That this feeling of not taking accountability, and yet we, about half an hour ago, we said, or I said, how important it was to be willing to, you know, not beat yourself up so much if you make
Yeah.
a mistake. And I think it's a really important way of thinking about this. So, and in a way, they're two sides of the same coin. So
Hmm.
for me, it's important to be able to accept, and I said this to someone in my family quite recently who um, she was sort of feeling like she was worried about making mistakes. And I said, look, you are going to make a mistake at some point. You are going to do it, and it's going to cost some money.
Yeah.
And you're going to feel embarrassed, and you're going to feel like you could have done something differently.
Hmm.
So expect that, but it's not the end of the world. You know, it is part of what happens in any project or in any business. Do your best. But if you know that, then I think that helps you to accept the fact that, yeah, I did make a mistake here, and
Hmm.
I will take accountability for it, and I will learn from it. I think for those of us who feel like making a mistake is completely anathema, um, you're not going to take accountability because you're not willing to accept that
Hmm.
you have made an error. So I think these two things actually come together. Yeah, willingness to take accountability. Yes, we do make mistakes, and I'm gonna take that and learn from it.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's such a delicate balance
Yeah,
because we don't want to go the one way where we just get held down like an anchor because of our constant failures when that's not really the case.
absolutely.
But I think about how if you are able to admit, hey, I messed this up or I made a mistake, and you're able to express that to those that you're leading, well, generally, that's going to humanize you. And now they're going to be willing, they're not going to be afraid to speak up when they see something or they've messed something up. I know from our backgrounds, we definitely know about hiding mistakes or not
Yeah,
being unwilling. Just we can't talk about that, and
hmm,
you think about that just creates far-reaching negative effects.
yeah,
So that no nobody made a mistake, everything's fine. The emperor's new clothes kind of
yeah.
viewpoint, and then you can see where that goes down a road that's not good.
Absolutely. So you before we started, you mentioned that there was a kind of model that you thought was quite useful for this sort of topic. Do you want to tell us about
Yeah,
that,
yeah,
Gerald?
sure. There's a book. It's by an author, Kim Scott, and it's called Radical Candor: Be a Kick-Ass Boss Without Losing Your Humanity. And I thought it was interesting because of the fact that it breaks down two sides of the coin, if you want to call that. It's called caring personally, but also being able to challenge directly. And you think about leaders. Generally, people are known as either one way or the other. It's like they're the tyrannical boss that their word is final, and then you got the
Yeah,
other ones that are, oh, they're so caring and kind, and and basically her idea is that you got to have a little bit of both, but it has to be from a genuine position. And so she basically talked about there's I guess you call it the radical candor quadrants. So there's four areas if you wanted
okay.
to imagine up on a sheet of paper.
Hmm.
The first one is called radical candor, and for that one, you care about the person. You also challenge them. So there's that genuineness to it. So that's the spot where you want to operate in. And I hope my I've got my mirror image on my video. I don't know what it's going to look like. You keep pointing to the same square, Jared. No, but bear with me. Um,
Yeah,
but opposed to that is that you can have what they call ruinous empathy, and that really is a situation where you care about the person, but you do so to the point where you care so much you don't challenge them, you don't try
mm,
to correct their mistakes. So that's like really bad. That's actually just as detrimental as somebody that's that iron fisted ruler.
yeah,
And then somewhere in between there, you have what's called the quadrant of manipulative insincerity. And I thought that one was an interesting way to call it. They they don't care. They don't challenge you. it's it's like another really bad way of doing things. And then you've got the other one called obnoxious aggression. And for the obnoxious aggression, I love how she calls these things. It's like I need to draw this up on the whiteboard when I'm at work. But they provide feedback without any care about the person.
Mm.
And ultimately, I think that if you take a little bit from each one of these quadrants, you come up with, I need to be able to challenge my people that I'm leading, but I need to do so tempering it with understanding how they're viewing the information and what situation they are in. And this one size fits all leadership is going to fail a lot of times. You have to be able to address individuals based on who they are. And the challenge with that is that as you have a larger group of people to lead, you have to be able to delegate some of that leadership down so that they can basically emulate what you're trying to accomplish.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice. Yeah, I'll have to check that book out. We'll put the link to that book on the show notes if people want to follow that up. Yeah, it reminds me a bit of one of the things that we do on our training courses is try to get leaders to think about what outcome they want from any interaction.
Mm-hmm.
So this is particularly around, I suppose, a one-to-one interaction. So I always say to people, if you're trying to improve somebody's performance, let's say, as an example, somebody's performance isn't reaching the standard that you would like it to. One thing you can do, obviously, you can ignore it. Another thing you can do is you can go and give them a great telling off. That might make you feel better, or it might be a release of your frustration and anger. But before you have a talk to them, I would say, what do you want out of that conversation, and write those things down. So I want them to understand what the issues are. Okay, I want us to have a plan for how they're going to improve. Okay, great. What else do you want? Or what else don't you want? Well, I want to be able to still maintain a good working relationship with them because we have to work together. Okay, that's another thing then. And then if you clear about all those outcomes, and that'll determine how you then approach it. And too often we steam in because we're frustrated and angry. And actually, the only thing that we're getting as an outcome there is a release of our frustration. So, yeah, I'm always keen to say, just think before you start down that road, before you start saying anything, what outcome do you want? And then the next words that are about to come out of my mouth, are those going to help me deliver that or not?
Yeah.
And that's similar. I think that, that sits in one of those quadrants, I'm sure.
Yeah. Great points. Yeah, no, it's such a balancing act, isn't it? I mean,
Yeah.
and I think back to your original story with the jeweler, the the fact that you have all these great ideas, you have this great model, and then you mess it up, you know.
Yeah, it's a good point because one of the, when you listen to that speech, he talks about, before we came along, if you looked at a jeweler's window, you couldn't see any prices. There were no prices on anything. He said, but we knew that our customers wanted to see prices on things before they went in the shop. In back in those days, if you went in, the jeweler would lock the door behind you. He said, but we have the open door. In fact, now we don't have doors. And in fact, that is how most jewelers operate now. There aren't any doors.
Yeah.
Um, Obviously, they have to think about security, but
Mhm.
that's done in a different way. So these were all great innovations and obviously making jewelry during a recession that people could actually buy was very, very sensible. So, yeah, it did so many great things. Um, and yes, as you said, just sort of blew it all because of that mistake.
I'm glad he didn't have the motto, "We have jewelry that no one wants to steal."
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah,
sorry.
that's
I'd be
that
a
that's
terrible, terrible jeweler
bitter.
too. I would have been
Yeah.
sacked too. Uh,
Cool. Well, I think we're probably there, aren't we? I
yeah,
was going to briefly mention Enron. Now, I think everybody's podcast and their daughter's podcasts have talked about Enron.
sure.
It does follow some similar patterns, but I suppose the one thing I will say about Enron, um, which is perhaps a bit different, is the link to our first episode, which is about charisma,
Mm-hmm.
because there's quite an interesting link that an academic called Dennis Turish draws between transformational charismatic leadership and what happened in Enron, particularly in terms of the culture of the place,
Mm-hmm.
So maybe we'll talk about that another time. But I think it's quite interesting how they created this environment where it was all about the leadership. People were love bombed to start with. It was all about, come on, join us. It's wonderful. It's wonderful. It's
Mm-hmm.
wonderful. And then they were told that they were no good. They had this rank and yank system, which I think is
Yeah.
quite interesting, where they would rank everybody in 3 tiers. The top tier would be given lots of bonuses. The middle tier would be told they need to keep going and sort of helped a bit. And the bottom tier basically would pull your socks up or you're gone, and
Mm-hmm.
they would be the ones that would be yanked. And so this created a culture of, again, fear, not helping each other, not admitting if you're wrong. So again, I think this echoes a lot of what we've already said. But yeah, interesting topic. We'll perhaps cover that another day.
Yeah, definitely a good one to discuss further.
Yeah. Great. Well, thank you very much, Jared. That's been
Yeah.
really, really interesting. So, listeners, this is the
Oh,
third of our podcasts. In the time that we've been doing this, I've actually created an Instagram page. So, join us on Instagram. The handle is called Leadership Pod. So,
yeah.
join us on there. And obviously, very early days. We've got nobody following us yet. So, join us on there, and we'll build up a bit of a following, and we'll put some thoughts upon that as we sort of carry on with this podcast. So don't forget to join us again. Subscribe if you're on YouTube. Follow if you're on Apple Podcasts, or do whatever you have to do to make sure that you catch us again. Thank you very much, everybody.
Have a good one.